everybody. I think the microphone's on. My name's Mike Butcher. I'm editor-at-large for TechCrunch. And I have with me Tom Hulme, who is a partner at Google Ventures. Now, Tom, it used to be the case a few years ago. I remember you guys launching Google Ventures Europe at TechCrunch Disrupt, advert, TechCrunch Disrupt in Berlin, December. Come along. And that was a big hoo-ha, wasn't it? A big, but it sort of, you didn't really carry on. You sort of dropped the Europe bit. Now, why was that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So we launched just under 3 years ago in Europe, and like all things, it was sort of discovery-driven. It was a learning exercise, and the big question we had is there enough interesting stuff that we can add value to? And we can talk about how we try and add value, but is there enough interesting stuff we can add value to in Europe? And the answer to that question was a resounding yes. I mean, one of the most interesting things to me was, of the first 6 deals that I did in Europe, our US colleagues chose to co-invest in 4 of them. So, you know, I have 4 of my first investments. I've actually done 10 now in Europe, but of my first few, there's 2 GVs, a US GV and a European GV on the cap table, and that made no sense. So we decided to merge the 2, and it works well. And you know, there's some basic stuff, like we now enjoy real sort of aligned incentives with our US colleagues. We have over 50 people in the US that support the portfolio, and they absolutely love coming to Europe and supporting our businesses. And that's designers, PR, comms, hiring, machine learning experts. So it feels like we're in a good place at the moment.
Is there ever any thoughts or strategies about flipping some of the companies over to the US, or do you tend to grow them from where they've come from?
We tend to, look, the US has some advantages, not least market size and homogeneity, and capital. There's obviously more capital sizes, but actually we're sort of particularly interested in businesses in Europe that have an unfair advantage by staying in Europe. And so, you know, fintech in London is a great example of that. There are over 30 businesses that could buy a fintech company in London for more than $1 billion. There's not many industries like that, and you know, it's probably sort of level with New York, for example. So we asked the question, which of these businesses can succeed globally and have an unfair advantage by being in Europe?
You mentioned fintech, and that seems to be a growing theme for GV investments. There's a lot of challenger banks right now. There's a lot of talk about fintech generally. What do you think changed in the last few years to make fintech a bigger category for startups?
So it's a great question. Look, firstly, fintech's humongous. It's, I think, a $13 trillion industry, I read. And it's an industry that actually there hasn't been much consumer choice. There's not been any disruption through consumers, or much disruption through consumers choosing the best products or services for them. And increasingly, we as users expect service levels of Apple or all of the brands that we know have incredible net promoter scores. So why shouldn't we expect that through financial services? And so that's a thesis we've had. We have a thesis that we should create tools, fintech tools for developers to use and integrate early. So we invested in Stripe. We invested in Currency Cloud here in Europe. That's just a simple API that enables developers to build out tools. And more recently, we're also very interested in blockchain as a kind of technology. So not just the company which we invested in, but the technology broadly.
You did a decent investment into the blockchain company.
Yeah, we just participated. So blockchain, I try and proactively look at markets that have the potential to change our generation. Kind of change, I don't want to sound too...
change the world.
Yeah, exactly. Fighting the urge to say that. But I do think they'll change the world. And, you know, I've looked a lot at genomics, made some investments in that space, looked a lot in AI, and most recently looked a lot in blockchain. And so if you look at the sort of 2 aspects to it that are interesting, there's cryptocurrency, which most of you will know Bitcoin, many of you will know Ethereum, many of you will observe the new initial coin offerings. And they're getting traction for good reason, but the underlying technology, the blockchain, a distributed ledger, can actually disintermediate a lot of that $13 trillion we just talked about in fintech. Like, you know, many people would argue that Kickstarter is a market inefficiency. You don't need a broker in the middle, or even venture capital is. You know, in many ways, initial coin offerings are disrupting venture capital.
Well, yeah, or is it frustrated entrepreneurs who couldn't attract VC in the first place?
So this is the big question, and in truth, there will definitely be a lot of examples of those, but you could argue that, you know, that's true across startups generally. A very small percentage of startups go on to be great businesses. It's a steep-sided funnel, and I think that's true in initial coin offerings. But if you think about Bitcoin and Ethereum as startups, Bitcoin has a market cap of about $39 billion. Ethereum has a market cap of about $19 billion. You could argue they're two of the most disruptive startups on the planet in the last 10 years, and they are completely liquid, which is incredible to think about. Like, we're investing and worrying about what the next unicorn is. Bitcoin is a $40 billion unicorn in many ways that you can buy and sell instantly.
To what extent is it a tulip bubble? The tulip bubble being the famous South Seas bubble, or no,
Dutch.
the Dutch tulip bubble, where a tulip bulb would be worth, you know, £1,000 in the 18th century.
Yeah, more.
Or 17th century, I think. To what extent is that going on? And to what extent do you also, you know, these ICOs, these initial coin offerings, there are a lot of people going, you know, pump and dump. You know, they'll pump it up, get a lot of virtual cash, and then try and parlay that into real cash somehow, and maybe disappear, go and live in Singapore or something.
Yeah, so I understand the Dutch tulip kind of argument, and there is some speculation in there, but fundamentally there was very little utility in tulips. Like, they were rubbish store of value, which is one way you have utility, like gold is a better store of value.
Doesn't degrade as much.
No, correct. Gold sticks pretty well. Like, if you hide gold underground, it'll still be there in thousands of years. The same's not true of tulips. So that's the first point. And the second one is scarcity. There just wasn't the scarcity. They thought there was the scarcity. But right through human history, we found things that we think are scarce and use them to trade. So there's amazing examples of Pacific Islanders thousands of years ago that were using different sized shells as a currency. They'd even have tattoos reflecting the sort of scarcity of different sized shells. And so I actually, you know, I do believe that these cryptocurrencies solve the scarcity problem. I don't think they're going to become ubiquitous overnight. Bitcoin is so clever for that.
Well, Bitcoin is scarcity because there's only, what, 21 million?
22, I think.
22. So Ethereum, infinite, in theory.
Yeah, in theory, but then we go back to the utility. And so there's two kind of modes of value. One is a store of value in Bitcoin or Ethereum, and the other one is as a medium of exchange in Bitcoin. And I think I'm starting to see people trade and sort of exchange for goods and services like a fiat currency with Bitcoin. So I would be optimistic that you'll continue to see it be a useful store of value, and then you get some speculators, so it's going to continue to be volatile, I would guess.
So why aren't you investing in more Bitcoin and more cryptocurrency
So
stuff?
we're looking at opportunities all the time. I mean, what I'm observing closely is this new initial coin offering, Tezos, that in the first 4 days raised $200 million. I think there's another day to run. They're incredibly interesting. I think one of the other things that we should all watch with interest is just the scalability of Bitcoin, which is a question that's sort of out there at the moment, just to see whether, or how much we need side chains for transactions. And the other thing with Ethereum is they're going to move to a sort of proof of stake rather than proof of work concept.
So what, you know, you must have discussions in GV about the legality of it all and whether or not regulators are going to become involved. For instance, there's this, as you said, there's this, whoever it is, you know, their Bitcoin address has raised effectively $200 million, and nobody knows how to tax them. Nobody can find them.
Correct.
Nobody knows how to tax them.
So I think
now, regulators want to tax people like this, don't
yeah,
they?
correct. And it's reasonable. You know, it's extraordinary to think that you could memorize a code and take $1 billion across the border just from that code. It's sort of equivalent to people using diamonds to transport value. The good news is, I think a lot of the regulators are becoming more and more progressive and see the value in something that actually they can track more easily, etc. And there's some quite forward-looking countries on this. Like you've got Japan, Estonia, Singapore is doing some really interesting stuff. So I don't expect...
The Bank of England has got a fintech sandbox as well.
Yeah, it has a group, exactly. The CEO of blockchain.com that we invested in, Peter Smith, is part of that. Mark Carney is a really smart guy and is thinking about this stuff all the time. So maybe we'll end up with some digital fiat currencies.
GV is also investing in a lot of health tech, isn't it? Now, you're not a scientist, technically speaking, but you've now done several deals in health tech, biotech-y type companies. Can you give us a flavor of the things that you're looking at or you've invested in that, because traditional biotech was quite different. It was very lab-based, etc. But now there's almost an interesting merging between the scalability of startups, of high-growth technology companies with the health space.
Absolutely. So you're right. I mean, I study physics, but I don't have a life science background. And when I joined GV, probably one of the areas that interested me most was life science, because it's just irrefutably good for humanity, a lot of these technologies. And what I started to observe was more and more technologists having impact in life science. I mean, it's an extreme point of view, but maybe we can each think of our bodies as an algorithm. And that algorithm, some of the base code is your DNA. It cost, in the Human Genome Project, billions of dollars to sequence your DNA. You know, Craig Ventnor's DNA 15 years ago. It now will cost about $100, $200. We think relatively soon. It's at less than $1,000 already. So the first time ever we can read our algorithms. Now, our bodies, we are 99.9% genetically identical. Our DNA is 99.9% the same, which, if that doesn't give us empathy for each other, I don't know what else should. We're only 0.1% different. If one in 180 babies has a chromosome defect, or we have DNA that mutates, maybe it's like computer code and we can address it. And so I've been learning a lot about genomics. I still have a lot to learn, but about a third of our investments globally are in life sciences. We have a phenomenal team led by a guy called Krishna Yeshwant in Boston, who's amazing, who helps kind of guide us on where the interesting ideas are. And so we've invested a fair amount in genomics, and I would expect us to do more. And then the application of genomics in things like immuno-oncology, which is the idea that we will start to use our own our responses to effectively tackle cancer. So there's incredibly interesting stuff in that. And I think Europe has a lot to be excited about. Like, if you look at the best universities...
Why Europe in particular?
We have some of the best universities and researchers globally in Europe. I've invested in both Oxford and Cambridge in the last year, and I'd expect to do a lot more.
Berlin?
So interestingly, there's a lot in mainland Europe. It's France, Germany. I would expect us to do more and more, actually. So that's something that we haven't started looking at life sciences across Europe, but I would expect us to.
Do you think there's a dystopian angle to this? Designer babies, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at the film Gattaca, I don't know if you've seen that phenomenal film, that's the idea that we would start to choose a sort of human race based on performance or intellect, and that technology already exists. And when you add in things like CRISPR, which in theory would allow us to edit our own DNA and sort of redesign ourselves, then there is a sort of dystopian example of that. But it's a tool, just like the internet is a tool, like artificial intelligence is a tool, and it might be used for good or evil. For me, the potential in using AI for good, or CRISPR for good, or genomics for good, while responsibly thinking about how it might be used for harm, it's unavoidable. The technology is coming,
it's going to happen.
And so we should harness it for the good.
Let's see if we can stop the craziness. Well, perhaps if it means I don't have to go to the gym as much, perhaps that might be useful.
You could, CRISPR in theory could give you fast twitch muscle like a Usain Bolt.
Yeah, just
You'd be an
inject
athlete.
some CRISPR, no, whatever it is. Now, let's do some other stuff. Now, Brexit is a big deal, obviously, whatever's going on there. Politics aside, there are technology investment funds, GV being one, who are now obviously having to develop a strategy about how they deploy capital. Does Brexit make a difference in how you deploy capital internationally?
Yeah, it potentially would. I think the big challenge we have at the moment is the uncertainty. None of us know what's going to happen. I think, if anything, it's become less certain over the last 3 months, which is bizarre. The good news is we are a global fund, and so our emphasis, our primary markets are Europe and the US at the moment, because we think they're the places that we add the most value. That's where we can introduce people to Googlers. That's where we have people that can support the portfolio. So when you think of Brexit in those terms, it's just a small blip in a small part of that big market we're addressing. I hope that it's not going to stifle British innovation by restricting immigration, which I see firsthand. If you look at my investments, so I've done 10 investments, and they are a diverse bunch of founders. There's 2 female-led companies. More than half of the companies I've invested in have founders that were not born or don't have the nationality of the country that they're building their business in. Like, migrants are unbelievably entrepreneurial, and as we build businesses, we don't just need those inspirational founders. They'll find a way to get there. We also need the senior management or the researchers, and we need to...
all that talent.
Yeah, we need all that talent, and like, particularly if you look at science, life science investments, I hope that we will keep relatively open borders to encourage immigration so the world is more meritocratic.
Is UK and Europe, are they going to benefit from Trump's cutting of the high-tech immigration visa?
It's a good question. I don't think we know enough about when that will happen and what impact that will have as of yet. But again, it's the sort of challenge. In many ways, this volatility is an opportunity for entrepreneurs. The uncertainty you could frame as an opportunity to test new models.
Okay, I wanted to just cut off,
Cut off.
Cut off. I wanted to finish, sorry, by talking about a little bit about how you're working with, like, the other VCs. You're doing a lot of co-investing at all?
Yeah, I actually, I think we recognize that we're building a franchise here in Europe. The franchise is better established in the US, and the model we have, given that we deploy a fair amount of capital, like we have about $2.5 billion under management. Our average check size in Europe has been over $7 million this year, and I'd expect that to slightly increase again. We expect to work with great syndicates of VCs.
But how low can you go in terms of investing?
So we've done early stage deals, but given that we're building a brand, I want and I hope that the investments that we make here in Europe would say we're the most or one of the most helpful investors. And to do that, we need to dedicate time. So I can't do 50 seed deals and truly add value and give the entrepreneurs the time and connect them into Google and connect them into our teams internally. So we have a preference to do slightly, fewer bigger checks, slightly later stage. And we always work with other VCs. There's not a single case of an investment where we're not working with other investors.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, we look forward to seeing what GV does next in Europe. Thanks very much, Tom Hulme.
Thanks so much. It's good to see you.
Thanks very much.